All right. Hey, everyone. First time speaking at SydJS. Thanks for the intro. So I'm going to be talking about building a multi-brand design system with Tailwind. Um, and some of the things I learned along the way, working on a client project over the last sort of roughly year and a half. And we kind of at one point decided we started off in a different styling library and we moved to Tailwind halfway through. And so this is kind of about that. So this is me. I'm Luke Bennett. I'm a senior software engineer at ThinkMill. Um, and I'm not in Queensland. I'm in Port Macquarie, New South Wales, just 5 short hours up the road. I know it's SydJS. Hopefully you'll let an outsider in if they feel welcome. And I've been using Tailwind for a long time. This is the earliest commit that I could find. This was 6 years ago. Might have been using this. I've probably been using Tailwind for a few months before that. But yeah, got in really early. It's 0.5.2 if you can't see. And these days I mostly work on design systems. But up until recently, we almost exclusively used Emotion for these sorts of projects. And I'm a big fan of Tailwind. I've got the shirt and everything. So why weren't we using it for design systems? What made Emotion better for that kind of thing? What made Tailwind maybe not appropriate up until at least recently? Well, there's a ton of trade-offs and challenges around Tailwind. So you need to weigh these things up. But the first one is the full class string needs to exist in the markup somewhere. So with the CSS and JS library, that sort of happens at runtime. It can build that inside the DOM. Tailwind has a JIT compiler, so it scans all your template files, looking for anything that looks like it might be a Tailwind class. And if it finds it, it's going to generate the CSS for it. Which means things like maybe a layout component where maybe you've got a padding prop that's responsive and you've got all the different breakpoints. So all your different spacing tokens for every single breakpoint, that's a ton of classes that all need to exist in the markup just so that props-based API is going to work. But there's a simple solution, and that's just to do what we've always done. Just use classes. Tailwind's got a really simple API, really kind of obvious. Just use a Tailwind class. It's totally fine. It's really easy to use. The developer experience, it's probably going to be even faster. So that's really not even an issue in my mind. The second one, this one is an issue. I'm a big TypeScript fan. We lost a little bit of type safety by moving to Tailwind. And the other thing is, out of the box, you don't have autocomplete. So you're kind of left to memory, and there's a big factor of potentially breaking things, and maybe you update something in your Tailwind config that invalidates some styles that previously were valid. And so without type safety, you might not know about those things. But there's kind of a solution, sort of. It doesn't fix the type safety thing, but you do get autocomplete with the IntelliSense plugin. It's got a couple of other cool features. So yeah, autocomplete, which is really nice. It's even highlights with colors and everything like that. It does some level of linting for you. So it'll let you know if you've got a common typo somewhere, if you maybe put multiple classes that are targeting the same CSS property, things like that. So there's some level of linting there. It's not type safety I'll give you, but there's something. And it's got this really cool hover preview where if you hover over a Tailwind class, it's going to bring up what CSS is going to get generated for you. And in some cases, if you're using rems or something, it'll even convert it to pixels for you, so it's easier to reason about. So it's actually a really cool plugin if you're using VS Code. The next one is overriding styles. So again, going back to CSS and JS, it's really, really a great mental model for developers, because working with objects, you've got a key value pair. I know the key is a CSS property that I'm targeting, and the value is if I can just change the value to override the styles. That's not the case with Tailwind. Here's a simple example. So I didn't componentize this because I'm trying to sort of show you everything all at once, but this is using Tailwind's REPL, the Tailwind play. And you can imagine you've got this button component and you're using the rounded LG class on it by default. And the consumer's got this one-off little thing here where they want to change it. So they use the class name prop, like I mentioned earlier, and they pass in rounded full. And so now you've got both those classes. And so you can see the VS Code extensions kind of built into the REPL. So you can see it's yellow. It's yelling at us saying that there's two things that are targeting the same property. But you can notice that it's rounded full is not being applied. It's not pill shaped now, it's just rounded corners. And the reason for that is if you look down the bottom, the CSS that gets generated, rounded full is first, rounded LG is second. So it's essentially alphabetical order. So the CSS properties, more or less, most of the time with Tailwind, they're going to be generated in alphabetical order. Now, the whole point of Tailwind is they're maximally reusable classes. So even if you could mess around with the order of those, which you kind of can't do, because the whole point of Tailwind, again, is that you kind of do everything in the markup and never really have to worry about the CSS file. You might fix something in one place and it'll break something else somewhere else. So that's not really an option. So the only real option is to try to remove the conflicting classes. But okay, rounded is fine, sort of, because you've got that sort of rounded prefix you can kind of go off. But like, what about things like the display property? You've got display, block and flex and grid and inline. If you're trying to change the display property on something that's kind of already built in, how are you going to do that? You just sort of, or at least you couldn't up until recently. But now there's this new library called Tailwind Merge. Now, behind the scenes, that does some ungodly things. So it's been trained to sort of know what every Tailwind class is and what properties they're targeting. So it knows, it'll look at your markup and it'll see that you've got multiple things targeting the same selector. It'll use the last one and throw away all the other stuff. So it's like a really useful tool. Another potential issue is like there's little one-offs. Every single project anyone has ever worked on, I don't care who you are, there's always been little one-offs that you've had to put in there somewhere. And with the Tailwind sort of model is like, no, it's utility. They say utility first, but really it's kind of utility only, almost. So like if you've got these little one-off styles, up until very recently, the solution had to be, well, that's when you just write regular CSS. But then that kind of breaks the whole kind of, again, I'm a React developer. I love the fact that I can sort of keep the view and the markup and the interaction kind of all in the one place together. And now there's just like another place in a couple of little places where that's somewhere else. And that's just, feels yucky, But Tailwind's added this thing called arbitrary variants, and then even later arbitrary properties. So you can start with the Tailwind prefix, the prefix of the prop. So let's go back to the rounded class from the button radius. So you got rounded colon, and then you do some sort of square brackets, and then you can put anything you want inside of there. You can put your own pixel value, and it'll generate that on demand because Tailwind's got a JIT compiler that's looking at things for it, and it just knows what that syntax means. It means just build something, but you need to like use underscores instead of spaces. But you can pretty much just write regular CSS inside of those square brackets and write almost any CSS you can imagine. It's surprisingly powerful. This is an example of some ungodly stuff that we did, really abusing that feature. This is a star rating component that's using, it's a radio button, like it's a bunch of radios under the hood. And like, hopefully you can sort of see that on the screen, but we're using like has selectors and like all sorts of really custom stuff, just so that we can kind of make this thing work where you've got all the different focus states. Obviously we're visually hiding the actual inputs and using sibling selector to style the SVG. Some really crazy stuff there, but like, that's an example of what you can do with that syntax. Wouldn't recommend it, but sometimes that's a good idea. That's the only choice. So these two things especially, the JIT compiler and the arbitrary values that came out with Tailwind 3, I think that really got people's brains thinking about like, hey, I think Tailwind is actually far more viable for a bunch of projects where previously it wasn't quite there. This is a quote from my boss, Jed. This is something he said to me recently that really stuck in my brain. Tailwind is like GraphQL for CSS. So in GraphQL, we define our schemas. In Tailwind, we put our tokens in a Tailwind config. In GraphQL, you create your queries. In Tailwind, you write your Tailwind classes. In GraphQL, we're never overfetching anything. We're just returning exactly what was queried to us. With the JIT compiler, it's exactly the same thing. So there's a lot of overlaps there, which is just really interesting. Like, we're big proponents of GraphQL, and if a new technology comes along that kind of gives us the same feeling, that's generally a good sign. It's worth looking at, right? So why do we switch to Tailwind for the design system that I was working on? Because it's one thing to say it's a viable option, but it's another thing to go, we're actually going to throw out everything that already exists and switch to something else. Well, there was a couple of reasons. I didn't have time to get into all the various sort of branding requirements that we had to do, but there was a lot, and we had to build all that stuff sort of by hand, which we were really happy with the result. It was like really powerful and modular, but it was really complicated too. And we're consultants. Like, okay, maybe it's okay for us to maintain, but this is kind of a design system that we're helping another team build, and they had a lot of other more junior developers that want to be able to contribute, and they should be allowed to contribute. So using Tailwind really lowered the barrier to entry for those people to be able to contribute and feel productive in the design system without a ton of training as to how it all works under the hood and extensive documentation. The next thing is we started using the design system, like dog fooding it in like a new app that they started working on. So it was a good chance to sort of try it out and sort of look for all the rough edges that maybe we missed as like when you're building something and using something, it's totally different things. So you see things in a different light. And we realized that we couldn't iterate as quickly as we wanted to on the design system, on using design system components. Because, with apps, the whole point is you're like iterating quickly. You need to sort of ship something, get it into people's hands, let people try it and test it and feel it and see what it's like, and just keep iterating over and over and over again. Whereas the design system is very different to that. It intentionally moves at a very slow, stable pace. This is something that's used across multiple applications, across the entire company. And so we can't afford to sort of make, lots of breaking changes or require extensive like training into how to use things. So Tailwind really made that a lot simpler because, again, you've got the power of all of Tailwind's like classes to sort of style anything you need. And once you sort of feed it all your tokens, you can build whatever you need. Yeah. And then the final one was that it just helped consolidate the tech stack. They had a lot of marketing websites as well, and there was a push they're all just a mismatch of kind of everything. Some things were WordPress, some things were hand-rolled utility framework, some things were bootstrapped, them, all over the place. And there was a push to start using Tailwind everywhere there and overall improve the quality of front end. And just consolidating on Tailwind was just like another reason that made sense. If we're training people how to use Tailwind, they can use the design system to feel right at home. Okay, so again, I don't have a ton of time to go into all the details, but there was a couple of interesting things that I learned when I got to really dive deep at the level that you do for a design system, but you wouldn't necessarily do for like an app or like a basic website. That I think were really interesting for share with you folks if you're considering using Tailwind. Not even for a design system, just for like serious projects. The first one was, if it's going to get used in lots of places, ship a preset. Tailwind comes with this concept of a preset, which is basically just a already customized Tailwind config. And it just makes the setup process so much easier and so much more maintainable because there's sort of less things that you need to sort of change as you update stuff. So here's an example. You probably can't see that too well on the screen. That's kind of the point though. This is ShadCN UI. This is what it generates for you. ShadCN UI is like a really popular React component library. And the idea of it is you use their CLI, it scaffolds out these components, and now they're your components. They're not something that's sort of stuck in node modules that you're kind of dependent on the developer. They're like, here's like Radix UI primitives. So they, mostly accessible out of the hood. Here's Tailwind to style it. And it's yours. But it spits out all the CSS in your CSS file with these custom properties. And those custom properties map to the Tailwind config on the right-hand side. And they need to always match. And it just sort of keeping those things in sync that felt kind of yucky to us. We didn't like that. And just look at what we can reduce it down to by using a preset. We've just got the preset and then the content array. So your source files, your templates of where it's going to look for Tailwind classes, and then where the design system components are. Like so much nicer and cleaner. The next thing is about overriding Tailwind's default theme. So I think one of the amazing things about Tailwind is it comes with a really extensive default theme that's not like opinionated enough that a lot of people bother to even change it too much. They just tweak a few things here and there where they need it, and then they'll just use the defaults elsewhere, which is great. But for a design system, at least for things like color and typography, where you're going to have opinions, you want to be able to turn a lot of that stuff off, especially the colors, because Tailwind comes with, I think it's like 900 different shades now. And obviously, if you're building an app with a design system, you're not meant to be using Tailwind's color palette. You're meant to be using the design system's color palette. And that's going to not only like mess up your IntelliSense with all these classes that you should never be using, but it's just like it's harder to find the things you need now as well. So you want to try to turn those things off. But I will point out that the best thing to do is to actually remove them from the theme object, because Tailwind does have these built-in, I think they're called core plugins, which you can turn off, but that means then that you can no longer extend them in your config. So that preset where I showed you earlier, you can still extend that further and add extra app-specific stuff if you want to. But if that plugin's turned off, then it's gone. It doesn't work anymore. Same with that arbitrary syntax. If you want to have a custom box shadow or something like that, you can't do shadow colon square brackets and then whatever your shadow is anymore. But you can still do the whole put the entire thing inside of square brackets, so you can do square bracket box shadow and then the whole thing. But it's just not worth it. So by making the preset a function, we can put some flags on to sort of turn those things on or off. Because maybe you've already got Tailwind in an app and you're incrementally adopting the design system, or maybe you've got like a marketing sort of style page that needs a bunch of extra non-design system stuff, and so you want to be able to sort of use both. And so by using a preset, we can sort of set up flags to turn these things on or off as well. The next thing is we created a ton of Tailwind plugins. A plugin is just a way to sort of generate new valid Tailwind styles. When you create a plugin, the IntelliSense plugin is smart enough to know about them and give you autocomplete as well, which is great. And it's just pointing out too that the Tailwind sort of breaks up the styles into sort of three categories. There's the base layer, which is where the resets and global styles go. We use that for our colors, the custom properties for our colors, and a few other things. And then there's the component layer, which is where you've got a class that maybe targets multiple CSS properties that you want to be able to potentially override one of those with the utility. And so the utility is the last one, and they have the highest specificity. They're all flat, but they're defined later. So therefore, they'll win in the event of a tie. So again, hopefully, I've got a ton of code examples. Hopefully, this isn't too bad on the screen. But this is an example of the typography plugin that we created for a text, where we had, so we kept the text prefix because we wanted to sort of keep, again, people who are familiar with Tailwind, we wanted them to feel at home. And so they're used to using text prefix for styling font size. So we kept that. We turned the Tailwind's defaults off by default. And then we set up font family, font size, font weight, line height, and letter spacing for both regular text entries and as well as headings. So we've got utilities for those. With both of those, which basically means you almost don't need a text component anymore. You've just got text, text heading 14, and then you've got a 14 pixel font text heading component, which is great. The other thing is, you'll see at the bottom there, we made utilities for font weights as well. And the reason we did that was we wanted font weight to be themable, because you could imagine one brand might have really, really bold heading fonts and another one has really thin ones. And so by using new names for them, we can sort of make them themable, switch between different brands. This is our color plugin. Obviously, I've simplified it a little bit. There's a get colors function that I don't show you how that works. But basically, we're setting those custom properties at the base layer for on the root selector by default. And then if you've got a prefers dark color media query, it's going to use the dark selectors. And then there's also the ability to override sections of the UI or the entire app, depending on what strategy you choose with the light and dark classes. And you'll also notice that I've got the color scheme class there as well. And the main reason we've got that there is because things like scroll bars and native select menus and stuff like that, they're going to inherit the browser's the system settings. So if you're using Chrome and your Mac or your computer is set to dark mode in Chrome, and then you've got something that's set to light mode, you want the scroll bars and select menus and stuff to be light as well. So that's a little trick there, just in case you didn't know. Another component plugin that we built, so this is a component plugin, so it's targeting a bunch of different styles, is a focus ring class. And the beauty of these is we're not sort of saying that the focus ring is applied on focus or focus visible or anything. Because it's a Tailwind plugin, just using that component callback that we get from Tailwind, you can use any of Tailwind's variants to apply a focus ring. So it's really useful for things like a radio card, where maybe you want to use the has selector to style the card itself if there is an input inside of it that has focus. Things like that. And we've also set like a no focus ring there, just because it'd be really hard to reset those styles if you ever needed to do that. So to build that in as well. Okay, down to the closing thoughts. The main thing I wanted to ask is, would I pick Tailwind again for another future design system project? And the answer is, just like everything in software development, it depends, right? There is a ton of really valid reasons why you might not want to use Tailwind. The lack of type safety is a big one for a lot of people. Some of those strings, literally, I'm sure people feel physically ill reading them. If you want a design system, the whole point of it is, for some people, is to really enforce and have a strict set of styles that you can't really veer from. And if that doesn't work with your mental model of a design system, maybe Tailwind's not for you. Haven't used Tailwind merge. It's one of the things I don't love the most about it, because it's probably doing some ungodly black magic behind the scenes for it to know about all those things. If that scares you, maybe don't use Tailwind. And then finally, if you much prefer that props-based API of a different prop for every sort of attribute you're trying to style and set of classes, maybe Tailwind's not for you. But I think there is a ton of really good reasons. The docs online and just the sheer amount of resources is just astronomical. Tailwind is the biggest thing out there right now. So it's really easy to get started. And if you get stuck on something, it's really easy to get unstuck. Honestly, I think it's like the fastest DX in the game. I can build stuff so quickly in Tailwind now. I honestly think I could build most things without even looking at the page a lot of the time. It's just wild. Tailwind's variants, being able to prefix things with different breakpoints. So the MD breakpoint, I want a different amount of padding or whatnot. It's just chef kiss. It's just so simple and easy to use, and you can just create different variants for all sorts of different things. We ended up creating a plugin for forced color mode for people who are using like maybe Windows high contrast mode, which Tailwind actually, after we created that, shipped that support for that. There's a couple of other ones. I think we had one that was like a where selector, so we could lower specificity of things. It's just great. You can use it for any valid class. Arbitrary variance is so powerful, and I think it's a really great way of like getting an escape hatch for when you really need to do that nasty hack somewhere, and it doesn't leak out, right? It's not in a global CSS file that everything else is using now. It's contained to just that component where it's used, and it's really easy to come back and find later if you want to fix it. And then also, there's no runtime cost unless you're using Tailwind merge, in which case there is a little bit of a runtime cost, but I think it's kind of worth it. One thing I thought was really interesting was around the time we decided to switch over to Tailwind, a ton of other resources and libraries and other like projects all started popping up using Tailwind in interesting ways. So here's a couple of the ones that I found were really interesting. Tailwind itself has this Catalyst UI, which is they previously had Tailwind UI, which is it's a paid product, which is how they fund the open source library, which I think is great. We should support open source however we can. But previously it was kind of just very basic templates. It was in JSX, but it wasn't wired up like a component that you would use. Not so with Catalyst. It's basically a mini design system. Same with Next UI. This is one of the best examples of a full-fledged almost design system that I've seen. As part of that project, they also built the next one down, Tailwind variants. If you've ever heard of CVA, Class Variance Authority, or Stitches, it's basically the same API there, but specific for Tailwind. They claim, I haven't used it personally, but they claim that it's also fixes that kind of issue I mentioned earlier about responsive styles. They have like a higher order function that you could wrap your Tailwind config with. And it's apparently smart enough to be able to sort of generate those extra classes without you having to declare them in the markup. ShadCN UI, I mentioned briefly earlier. React ARIA components, fantastic. One of the most bar none accessible component library in the business. Great choice if you need a React library. If you're building a design system, they've got hooks at the really low level primitives. Then they've got React ARIA components, and then they also ship a Tailwind starter kit for you, which is again like a little mini design system. The Westpac, our friends in Sydney, Westpac also started building Tailwind into their design system for the Gel Next around the same time that we switched over. That's open source. I wish I could share the project that I built. It unfortunately is not on open source, so I'm going to have to share all these links. And then, yeah, finally, that's a link to my website. So yeah, if you found this interesting, please feel free to reach out to me. I've got contact links on my website. Thanks for having me.